"What's the matter, old man? Lose your pride along with your home." The suited man spat straight into the veteran's face, smirking as the crowd turned away. The veteran didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just stared at the man's shoes, like he'd seen men like him before. But the suited man wasn't ready for what came next, because from the edge of the alley, a figure stepped into the light. Calm, controlled, Jack Reacher. And when Reacher spoke, the street went ice cold. What happened next left everyone too scared to breathe. Welcome to Jack Reacher Heroics. Let's uncover what really happened. The sun had long set, casting an orange haze across the empty street. The city was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. In a narrow alley between two run-down buildings, a homeless veteran sat on the ground, his weathered face partially hidden beneath a torn baseball cap. His eyes, though dull with years of neglect, still held a quiet resolve, the mark of someone who had seen more than most could imagine. His hands, scarred and rough, clutched a weathered cardboard sign that read, "Veteran. Anything helps." The air was thick with the smell of garbage and decay, a stark contrast to the man's past life, a life he no longer spoke of, except in the quiet moments when he would close his eyes and remember. His uniform, once crisp and proud, now only a faded memory in his heart. Time had moved on, but it hadn't been kind to him. Then came the sound of footsteps. At first, they were distant, muffled by the night, but they grew louder, steady, deliberate. The man didn't look up. He knew better than to expect anything from the world around him. But when the footsteps stopped directly in front of him, he glanced up, his eyes squinting into the shadowed face of a young man, maybe in his 30s, dressed in a sharp suit, an expression of disdain on his face. Without a word, the young man took a step closer. The veteran's breath caught in his throat, a flicker of something cold in his chest. The young man paused, his gaze falling on the cardboard sign. Then slowly, deliberately, he spat right in the veteran's face. The veteran didn't flinch. He didn't move. His gaze remained locked on the man's shoes, his jaw tight. But something in the air shifted, the tension heavy. There was no apology, no remorse in the man's eyes. Just a smirk, as if he had just done something he believed was deserved. It was then, in the thick silence that followed, that Jack Reacher stepped out from the shadows. The young man stood over the veteran, a smirk still playing on his lips as he watched the spit slide down the veteran's cheek. The crowd of late-night stragglers, mostly intoxicated or indifferent, didn't seem to care much about what had just happened. They continued to shuffle by, avoiding the scene like they had all the others, a small skirmish in the daily grind of the city. But the veteran remained motionless, his eyes unwavering. He wasn't looking for a fight, but the man had crossed a line. He knew the world had moved on, leaving him behind in its rush. But there was something about this young man's arrogance, his entitlement, that stirred something deep inside him. The old soldier had lived through horrors, but he'd never let himself be reduced to this, being spat upon by someone who didn't understand the price of freedom. "Think you're better than me?" the young man taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. "I've seen men like you before, washed up, useless, living off handouts. Just a drain on society." The veteran blinked slowly, wiping the spit off his face with the back of his hand. His fingers trembled just slightly, but he didn't say a word. The young man's voice got louder, the insults coming faster now, as if each word fed his need to be seen. Then, through the murmurs of the crowd, a calm voice cut through the tension. "You don't know who you just touched," Jack Reacher said, his tone even but laced with a quiet menace. The young man turned, eyes narrowing. He hadn't seen Reacher standing there, his presence almost imperceptible in the shadows. Reacher didn't move. He simply stood, his eyes locked on the young man. The crowd went silent as they recognized the man, tall, broad-shouldered, with the air of someone who wasn't easily intimidated. The smirk faltered, and for the first time, the young man seemed to realize that maybe, just maybe, he had done something far worse than he intended. The young man's smirk wavered for a brief moment, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He looked Reacher up and down, sizing him up. The crowd, sensing the change in atmosphere, fell silent. It wasn't often you saw someone stand up to a man like this. The arrogance that had filled the alley just moments ago seemed to fade, replaced by a tension that grew thicker with every second. Reacher didn't move, his gaze steady and unyielding. His presence was something that demanded attention, but he didn't need to raise his voice to get it. The young man shifted on his feet, growing increasingly uncomfortable, but he wasn't quite ready to back down. "What's your problem, old man?" the young man sneered, his voice growing more defensive. He tried to regain control of the situation, but his bravado had slipped, leaving a raw edge to his words. Reacher stepped closer, his boots making a soft thud against the cracked pavement. "My problem." Reacher's voice was low, cold. "My problem is that you've forgotten what respect means. My problem is that you don't understand the weight of the actions you've taken." The young man's face tightened, his jaw setting in defiance. "Respect." He barked a laugh. "Respect is earned, not handed out to some washed-up vet asking for handouts." The veteran, still seated on the ground, didn't flinch at the insult. He'd heard it all before, but this time something in the air had changed. The word stung, yes, but it was the stranger's cruelty that cut deeper. The world had forgotten what heroes looked like, reduced them to beggars on street corners. Forgotten, too, the sacrifices made to protect those who now walked with their heads high, blind to the debts owed. "You've already earned something," Reacher said, his voice sharp, but not the way you think. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You've earned the chance to learn what happens when you spit on the wrong person." The young man stood frozen, caught between the fear creeping up his spine and the pride that had driven him to this point. He had spat on the veteran, dismissed him as nothing more than a relic of a forgotten past. But now, in the presence of Reacher and the tension thick in the alley, he began to question the decision he had made. The veteran, however, showed no signs of retaliation. His eyes, though weathered and worn, held a quiet dignity that spoke louder than any words could. His life had been shaped by hardship and sacrifice, but those moments had long since passed. There were no accolades for him, no medals on display, no hero's welcome. The world had moved on, and he had been left behind. He had fought in wars that most would never understand, and now he sat on this cold street corner, ignored and forgotten, a shadow of the man he once was. The battlefields were distant memories, faded like photographs left in the sun. He had once been someone, a soldier in a cause that meant something. Now, his only companions were the ghosts of his past and the empty streets that seemed to stretch on forever, indifferent to his existence. But Jack Reacher, standing beside him, wasn't indifferent. He saw what the veteran had been, and what he still was, beneath the grime and the years of neglect. The young man finally found his voice, though it came out unsteady, weak. "Who is he?" Reacher's gaze flicked to the veteran, who sat there, still and composed, not seeking sympathy. "You wouldn't understand," Reacher replied quietly. "Not yet, at least. But maybe you will. You see, this man fought for your freedom. He bled for it, and you thought it was okay to spit on him." The young man opened his mouth to retort, but something in Reacher's eyes made him hesitate. It wasn't anger. It was something far more dangerous, quiet, calculated resolve. The crowd stood still, awaiting whatever would come next. Jack Reacher had always been a man of few words, but his presence was undeniable. He hadn't announced his arrival with dramatic flair or forceful steps. In fact, he had entered the alley as quietly as any passerby. But in that silence, he had already become the pivot of the moment. It wasn't his size or his reputation that commanded attention. It was the stillness around him, the way the world seemed to pause when he stepped into a room. The young man, now clearly on edge, still held the microphone, but his bravado had evaporated. Reacher's steady gaze never wavered, locking onto the man with a sharpness that made him feel as though his every move had already been seen. No words. No threats, just a silence that hung in the air, so thick it could be felt in the bones of anyone who stood close. The crowd, a mix of onlookers and late-night wanderers, slowly began to realize who stood at the edge of the scene. Whispers spread, catching like wildfire. Reacher was no stranger to these streets, but even those who didn't recognize him by name could feel the weight of his presence. He was the kind of man who didn't need to announce his intentions. They were already written in the air. The young man, now unsure of himself, shifted uneasily under Reacher's unwavering stare. He had been the center of attention just moments ago, but now the crowd's energy shifted toward the calm man who had simply arrived and silently stood. The insult he had hurled at the veteran suddenly seemed so small, so insignificant. Reacher hadn't made a scene, hadn't raised his voice. But that was his power. In his silence, he conveyed a message louder than any scream could ever reach. The young man, for the first time, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He wasn't the one in control anymore. That mantle now rested with a man who had yet to say a word. The young man shifted uncomfortably under the weight of Reacher's gaze, the silence between them stretching out like a rope pulled taut. His earlier bravado had dissipated, replaced by something unfamiliar, doubt. He had expected his insults to be met with nothing more than indifference. But now, with every passing second, the air seemed to tighten, as if the universe itself had turned its focus on him. He glanced nervously at the crowd, trying to gauge their reaction. They weren't cheering him anymore. Some had stopped talking, their attention riveted on the scene unfolding before them. Others exchanged uncertain glances. The man's confident stance had faltered, and his cocky smirk had been replaced by the uncertainty of someone who realized he had made a mistake. Reacher stood there, still as a stone, a figure of quiet authority. He didn't need to make demands, didn't need to challenge the young man with forceful words. His presence was enough. The veteran, still sitting on the ground, hadn't moved either. His eyes had closed, as though he was no longer interested in what was happening around him. It was as if he had seen it all before, too many times to count, and had long since lost the energy to care. The young man, with the microphone still in his hand, tried to salvage his dignity. He wiped his forehead, glancing nervously at the crowd. "What's your problem, man?" he spat, but it lacked the conviction it once had. "This is none of your business." Reacher's voice cut through the tension, calm but firm. "You're wrong. This is my business now." The words hung in the air, carrying more weight than the young man could ever comprehend. Reacher wasn't speaking for the veteran. He wasn't speaking for anyone except himself. And what he had just done, what he had just said, was his judgment. And somehow, it was worse than any insult or public humiliation. Because with Reacher's words came the understanding that the young man had just crossed a line, and now there was no easy way to undo it. The young man's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow as Reacher's stare bore into him. It was a stare that cut through the noise of the alley, silencing everything around them. The crowd had gone eerily quiet, as if they too could feel the weight of the moment. There was no anger in Reacher's eyes, just a cold, focused intensity that seemed to strip away the layers of bravado, leaving only the raw truth behind. The young man's hand shook slightly, the microphone now feeling like a foreign object in his grasp. He had been used to being in control, used to walking into a room and making people listen to him. But in this moment, he was nothing. A petulant child standing in front of a man who had seen too much to be impressed by any of his antics. Reacher didn't blink, didn't break his gaze. His eyes were steady, unwavering, and it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The young man shifted from foot to foot, his bravado cracking like glass. He couldn't look away. He didn't know why. But it was as if Reacher's stare had pinned him in place, made him feel as though every action he had taken in the last few minutes had been foolish, meaningless. "You think you've earned the right to disrespect a man who's given everything for this country?" Reacher's voice was low, like a drumbeat beneath the surface, firm and unyielding. "You think your little stunt here is something to be proud of?" The young man's mouth went dry, his earlier words feeling like they belonged to someone else. He had thought he was powerful, had believed his insults were a way to prove his superiority. But now, faced with Reacher's quiet authority, he realized just how hollow his actions had been. Reacher's gaze remained fixed, the weight of it pressing down on him, and the young man felt the sting of shame rise within him. For the first time in his life, he wondered what it meant to truly face the consequences of his actions. The young man stood frozen, his confidence shattered by the weight of Reacher's stare. His earlier words, his spit, everything he had done seemed distant now, like a bad dream that couldn't quite be shaken off. The crowd had faded into the background, their eyes all on him, waiting, wondering how he would respond. But he was no longer sure of himself. Reacher's voice broke the silence again, steady, firm. "You think words like those don't matter?" he asked. "You think your little insult, your spit, doesn't have a cost?" The young man's throat tightened. He had expected to mock the veteran, to show his power, to be the one in control. He had expected laughter, applause, maybe even admiration for his bravado. But now, facing Reacher, it felt as if the ground beneath him had cracked open, and he was falling, unable to stop himself. "You spit on a man who fought for you, for this country," Reacher continued, his voice cutting through the young man like a blade. "You thought it was just an empty act, some harmless show of strength. But it's not. The things you say, the things you do, they matter more than you think. They cut deeper than you'll ever know." The young man opened his mouth, but no words came out. He could feel the weight of Reacher's judgment pressing down on him, each syllable adding to the suffocating pressure in his chest. For the first time, he wasn't in control. He wasn't the center of attention. Reacher had taken that from him without lifting a finger, without raising his voice. "You don't get to disrespect someone like that," Reacher said, taking a step closer, his presence undeniable. "You don't get to walk away like nothing happened. Not today." The young man's hands trembled as he lowered the microphone, unable to meet Reacher's gaze anymore. His earlier bravado, his cocky smirk, they were gone. In their place was something darker, something he didn't fully understand, but that he couldn't ignore. The words, the way they had cut so deep, lingered in his mind long after the silence returned. The veteran remained seated on the cold pavement, his eyes distant, unfocused, as the young man stood silently before him. The world around them seemed to blur, the sounds of the city muffled by the heaviness in the air. Reacher had made his point, but the veteran had yet to speak. His silence hung there like a weight, as if every word he could say had been worn down by the years, by the battles, both on the front lines and the ones that followed. The young man, still processing the scorn he had just received, couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. Something important. He looked at the veteran, his face weathered and rough, his clothes ragged. The man's presence was quiet, but it spoke volumes. The spit, the insults, it all felt meaningless now. He could see it in the way the veteran held himself, as if everything that had happened before, all the battles fought, had made him impervious to the cruelty of others. The silence lingered, and then, unexpectedly, the veteran spoke. His voice was low, raspy, but there was no anger in it, only an undeniable sadness. "Did you know what it was like?" he asked, his eyes never meeting the young man's. "To watch your friends fall, to hear the screams of men you fought beside, knowing you couldn't save them." The words cut through the young man like a blade. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the rawness, the truth behind the silence. The veteran wasn't speaking of glory or honor. He wasn't recounting victories. Instead, he was sharing something darker, a truth the young man had never been close enough to understand. "You think I'm just here for your pity or your coins?" the veteran continued, his hands now gripping the cardboard sign more tightly. "But what you don't know is that I've lived through things that make your little insult seem insignificant." The young man stood speechless, struck by the weight of those words. The cruelty he had shown wasn't just an act of disrespect. It was an ignorant dismissal of a life lived through pain, sacrifice, and loss. A history he could never comprehend. The young man stood, shifting from foot to foot, his mind racing as the weight of the veteran's words sank in. For the first time, he felt the sharp sting of something he hadn't expected: shame. The words the veteran had spoken had cracked open a door he didn't know was there. What had started as a harmless attempt to show off, to dominate, now seemed like an unforgivable act. The veteran, in his quiet, weathered way, had turned the tables. It wasn't just about a spit or a taunt. It was about everything the young man didn't know, everything he had taken for granted. The veteran's eyes slowly lifted, finally meeting his gaze. There was no accusation, no anger. Only a tired sadness, as if this moment, this confrontation, had been written in the pages of the past long ago. "You think it's easy, don't you?" the veteran muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Living in a world that forgets men like me. Like us." The words hit hard, a sharp reminder of how the world had moved on, leaving behind those who had given everything. The young man, now at a loss for words, stood still. He had never considered the cost of the things that were now so easily taken for granted. The freedom, the safety, the very dignity of being able to walk through life unchallenged. He felt the sting of regret, a gnawing sense of responsibility that clawed at his insides. This wasn't about what he had done. It was about the realization of how little he had understood. He hadn't just insulted a man. He had insulted a lifetime of sacrifice, a history buried in silent suffering. He had taken more than respect. He had taken dignity. In that moment, the young man knew he would never forget this. He could never undo the damage, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could begin to understand what it meant to earn respect, not through words or arrogance, but through actions. Through the quiet, humble grace of knowing what others had given and what he had taken without a second thought. The young man stood there, staring at the veteran, his mind a swirl of confusion and guilt. He had been so sure of himself just moments ago, so certain that his words and actions were justified. Now, in the face of this man who had fought and bled for a country that had forgotten him, he felt small. He felt exposed. His chest tightened, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know how to respond. Reacher, standing quietly to the side, had been watching the interaction with a quiet intensity. The scene was unfolding just as he had expected. It wasn't about physical confrontation. It never was with men like this. It was about something deeper, something that needed to be addressed, not with force, but with understanding. The young man needed to realize the weight of what he had done, the long-lasting consequences of his disrespect. "Do you understand what you've done?" Reacher's voice finally broke the silence. It was calm, but there was an edge to it that made the young man flinch. The young man swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't think it was a big deal," he mumbled, as if the words themselves were a weak defense. He had never considered the long-term effects of his actions, how a moment of arrogance could ripple outward, leaving damage in its wake. Reacher stepped forward, his presence filling the space between them. "It's not just about what you did to him," he said, nodding toward the veteran. "It's about what you've done to yourself. You've crossed a line that's harder to erase than you think." The young man looked down at the ground, feeling the full weight of Reacher's words settle deep within him. The truth was inescapable now. This wasn't a matter of pride or strength. It was about justice. It was about recognizing the humanity in others, especially those who had sacrificed so much. He had taken something from a veteran, but now it was time to give it back. He raised his eyes, meeting Reacher's unwavering stare. "What do I do now?" he asked, the question coming out with a sense of desperation. Reacher's answer was simple. "Make it right." The young man could feel Reacher's eyes on him, unblinking, as if they were burning into his very soul. There was no judgment in them, no anger, just a cold, calculating focus that seemed to dissect him piece by piece. Every mistake, every misstep, every ounce of arrogance that had led him to this moment was laid bare under that unwavering gaze. He wanted to look away, to escape it, but something inside him kept him rooted in place. Reacher's presence was like a force that held him, forced him to confront the consequences of his actions. The veteran, still sitting quietly on the ground, seemed to be lost in his own thoughts, unaware or perhaps uncaring of the shift taking place around him. But the young man couldn't ignore it. He could feel the weight of everything crashing down on him. The years of privilege he had taken for granted, the disrespect he had shown, and now the heavy burden of trying to make things right. "Look at me." Reacher's voice cut through the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was firm, and it commanded attention. The young man hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking nervously between the ground and Reacher's unyielding gaze. But he knew, deep down, that he had no choice. He had to face it, face the truth, even if it was uncomfortable. Slowly, he raised his head, locking eyes with Reacher. For a long moment, there was only silence. Reacher didn't speak, didn't move. He just stared, his gaze sharp and steady, as if waiting for the young man to understand the weight of what had been done. The young man felt something inside him shift. It was a quiet realization, a flicker of understanding that he couldn't quite put into words. The arrogance, the dismissiveness, it was all so insignificant now. What mattered was the pain he had caused. What mattered was the man who had fought for his freedom, only to be spit on by someone who had never truly appreciated that sacrifice. In the stillness, Reacher's eyes held him accountable. And for the first time in his life, the young man understood the true meaning of respect. The young man's heart raced as he stood under the weight of Reacher's gaze, the silence between them stretching on, thick and suffocating. He had expected some kind of explosive response, something loud to match the arrogance he had shown. But what he hadn't anticipated was this: Reacher's quiet presence, his stillness, which felt far more powerful than any angry shout. Reacher didn't need to say more. The young man could feel the sting of his own actions now, sharper than any physical blow. He had been so certain of his superiority just moments ago, but now the truth had been laid bare before him. What he had done to the veteran wasn't just an insult. It was a wound, a sharp, cutting reminder of how little he had truly understood. And yet, as he stood there, the weight of Reacher's unyielding stare, he felt something unexpected stir within him: regret. It was as though the silent accusation in Reacher's eyes had peeled back the layers of his arrogance, exposing the raw truth. He had taken the veteran's dignity, and, in the process, he had lost something of his own. The veteran had not moved since the confrontation began. His expression remained unchanged, his eyes distant, as if he had long since accepted that this was the world he now inhabited. But as Reacher stepped away, there was no overt gesture of vengeance. No shout, no grand confrontation. It was in the quiet that the retaliation lay. Reacher hadn't struck the young man physically, but in a way, the silence had hurt far more. There was no force behind Reacher's actions, just the quiet understanding that some things couldn't be fixed with words or fists. The young man's arrogance, the disrespect he had shown, would follow him. It would linger in the silence that Reacher had left behind. As Reacher turned to leave, his back to the young man, the message was clear. The true retaliation wasn't in violence, but in the consequences of a moment he would never forget. The young man stood there, watching as Reacher walked away, the weight of the moment sinking in deeper with each passing second. His chest tightened, and his mind raced. He could feel the quiet but undeniable shift in the air, the calm after the storm. Reacher had given him a lesson, one that didn't require words or theatrics. It was a lesson about dignity, respect, and the invisible ties that bound people together, even when they couldn't see them. The veteran's figure, small and hunched on the ground, finally registered in the young man's mind. He had been so caught up in his own arrogance that he had failed to see who the man truly was. But now, the weight of the veteran's presence felt undeniable. This wasn't just any homeless man. This was someone who had fought for him, fought for a country that had long since forgotten him. The young man's thoughts drifted, as if caught in the pull of something larger than himself. He didn't understand it all yet, but there was a connection here, a link that stretched far beyond this alley, beyond the insults, beyond the pride that had clouded his vision. The veteran wasn't just a symbol of the past. He was a living testament to the cost of freedom. The young man had never served in the military. He had never known the sacrifice that came with wearing a uniform, the bond that tied soldiers together through shared experiences, through the unspoken understanding that they were all part of something much larger than themselves. He had never felt the weight of that commitment, the sacrifices made, the friendships forged in the fire of battle, the shared pain of loss. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath of his encounter with Reacher, he could feel the stirrings of something that transcended his own small world. It wasn't just about the spit or the insults anymore. It was about understanding the sacrifices others had made and recognizing the invisible threads of connection that bound them. He glanced back at the veteran, his heart heavy with something he couldn't name. For the first time, he saw the man not just as a stranger on the street, but as someone who had paid a price he could never truly repay. And in that moment, the weight of his own privilege, his own ignorance, felt crushing. The young man stood in the alley, the sounds of the city fading into the background. His eyes were fixed on the veteran, who remained unmoved, his body a silent testament to years of hardship and unseen battles. It wasn't just the veteran's stillness that caught the young man's attention. It was the quiet strength that emanated from him, the kind of strength that couldn't be measured in words or actions. It was something deeper, something earned through years of survival, loss, and sacrifice. The veteran had not responded to the young man's taunts, nor had he fought back in any traditional sense. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't retaliated with any kind of physical force. Instead, he had simply existed, and in his quiet way, he had shown the young man more than any confrontation could have. The young man's gaze shifted to Reacher, who stood off to the side, watching everything unfold with an intensity that suggested he had seen this before. There was something about the way Reacher observed the scene that spoke volumes. He wasn't just a bystander. He was a man who understood. He knew the weight of words, the cost of pride, and the kind of man who could stand in the face of insults without flinching. It wasn't the first time Reacher had encountered someone like the veteran. He had seen men like him before, men who had given everything to their country, only to be forgotten by the world they had fought for. Reacher had been around long enough to recognize the unspoken bond between soldiers, the quiet understanding that passed between them, even when words were left unsaid. The young man had underestimated that bond, had failed to grasp the depth of the veteran's strength, not because he didn't want to, but because he had never had to. He had lived a life where respect was assumed, where entitlement came without question. But now, in the presence of a man who knew sacrifice and pain, he understood what it meant to truly earn that respect. As he stood there, something shifted inside him. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could choose a different path now. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to be a man who knew. The young man stood in the alley, his mind heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. Reacher had said little, but the silence between them had been enough to make him feel like the world had turned upside down. The veteran, still sitting silently, seemed like a man who had been through far more than anyone could comprehend. And Reacher was a man who knew. That much was clear. But it wasn't just about what had happened in the last few minutes. It was about what had been left unsaid, what had lingered in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. The young man could feel the weight of his ignorance pressing down on him, crushing him with the realization that he had spent so much of his life blind to the world around him. He had never truly understood what it meant to sacrifice, to give everything for something larger than himself. Reacher's eyes had never left him, steady and unyielding. It wasn't anger that Reacher had conveyed. It was something far deeper, something that spoke to the core of the young man's character. Reacher had given him a chance, not with words, but with the quiet presence that seemed to strip away all the noise and leave only the truth. "You've got a lot to learn." Reacher's voice cut through the silence again, and the young man looked up, meeting his gaze. There was no judgment in Reacher's words, no condemnation. Just a simple statement, an acknowledgement that the young man hadn't yet seen the world as it truly was. The veteran, still sitting against the wall, finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "I didn't fight for you to spit on me," he said. "I fought for you to have the chance to understand, to see what it means to live in a world where others bleed for your freedom." The words hit harder than anything Reacher had said. The young man stood, frozen, as the truth flooded him. He hadn't understood until now. He hadn't understood the cost of his privilege, the weight of the lives that had been lost, so he could live the way he did. The truth, stark and undeniable, revealed itself, and in that moment, he understood the kind of man he wanted to become. The veteran remained silent, his gaze focused on the ground in front of him, as if the weight of his past had pulled his eyes down, tethered them to memories he had long since learned to live with. The young man felt the absence of words like a tangible thing, heavy in the space between them. There was nothing to explain, no apology to offer. The veteran had already given everything he could in the silence of his presence. The young man tried to speak, to offer something, anything to bridge the gap, but the words caught in his throat. It was as though the more he thought about what he had done, the less he could understand it. He had been blind, thoughtless, and now the reality of that cruelty felt suffocating. He wanted to say he was sorry, but he knew that the words would never be enough. They would never erase the spit he had aimed at this man's dignity, the insult he had hurled without thought. What was left to say when you had already taken something so irreplaceable? The veteran's silence stretched on. It was in that silence that the young man began to truly hear. He heard the weight of every word he had thrown carelessly, heard the years of service, the battles fought, and the sacrifices made. He heard the quiet resignation in the veteran's stillness, as though he had long since accepted that this was how it would be, that the world had forgotten, and he had no choice but to fade into the background. The young man took a step closer, but stopped, unsure of how to bridge the chasm that had formed between them. Reacher watched from the edge of the alley, his eyes unreadable but observant. The veteran didn't look up, didn't move. His silence was enough. It spoke volumes, louder than any words the young man could say. The young man stood, caught between the desire to apologize and the realization that sometimes silence was the only answer. The quiet that had settled in the alley stretched on, the air heavy with unspoken tension. The young man stood there, his mind racing, feeling the weight of everything he had just learned. Reacher was watching him, his steady gaze still fixed, but it was the veteran's silence that seemed to fill the space, pressing in on him from all sides. It was as if the veteran had become a part of the alley, an immovable object that refused to be ignored, even though he said nothing. But just as the young man thought the silence would swallow him whole, a voice broke through. It was soft at first, almost a whisper, and it came from a woman who had stepped into the alley from the shadows. "You're not the only one who owes him something," the woman said, her voice steady, calm but sharp with purpose. She was dressed in dark clothes, blending into the night, but her presence was undeniable. She walked past the young man, her gaze flicking briefly toward him, before stopping in front of the veteran. The young man blinked, surprised, as the woman knelt down beside the man he had just disrespected. There was a tenderness in the way she moved, as if she had known him for years, and it was a quiet reminder that this wasn't just a random encounter. The veteran was more than the sum of his scars and his silence. He was a part of something larger. "I know you," the woman said softly to the veteran, reaching out to rest her hand gently on his arm. The young man didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do as the woman spoke. "You don't have to fight for recognition. You've already done enough. You've already paid the price." The words hit him harder than anything Reacher had said. It was a quiet intervention, but it carried more weight than the young man had ever expected. She wasn't asking for his apology or his respect. She was reminding him of the dignity that the veteran had already earned, and that no amount of cruelty could take away. The young man's chest tightened, his shame deeper than before. For the first time, he understood the magnitude of what had happened. He wasn't the one who had the power in this moment. The veteran, with his silence, had already won. The alley was quiet now, the buzz of the city a distant hum in the background, almost drowned out by the weight of the moment. The young man stood, his mind a tangle of thoughts, but all he could focus on was the woman who had intervened. Her words, her calm presence, had shifted the air around him. They had reached something inside him, something that had been buried beneath his arrogance and pride. The veteran, still sitting on the ground, didn't speak. His eyes were closed, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a softening that only someone who had spent years in his shoes would notice. The young man's heart ached as he thought about the way he had treated him, about how the world had treated men like him, forgotten them, brushed them aside as if their sacrifices meant nothing. He stepped forward, slowly at first, unsure of what he could say that would make a difference. The silence had taught him that words were often inadequate, that apologies sometimes felt hollow when the damage had been done. But he had to try. He had to do something. He stopped just in front of the veteran, close enough now to see the lines on his face, the faint tremor in his hands. The veteran still hadn't opened his eyes, still hadn't acknowledged him. But the young man felt something shift in the space between them, a quiet connection, the beginning of understanding. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't enough, but it was all he had. He wanted to say more, to explain, but the words felt too small, too fragile against the enormity of the moment. "I didn't understand." For a long time, there was no response. The veteran didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The young man could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed, in the small nod that came after a long pause. It wasn't forgiveness, not in the way the young man had expected. It was something deeper, something more profound, the understanding that sometimes the only way to move forward was to reach out, to make an effort, no matter how small. And in that moment, it was enough. The young man lingered there, his breath steady but his heart still racing, as he watched the veteran. The silence between them felt different now, less suffocating, more like a bridge being slowly built. He had spoken his apology, but it wasn't just the words that had begun to matter. It was the realization that had taken root inside him. He had no idea who this man was, who he had been before the street corners and the cardboard signs. The young man had never stopped to think about the history the veteran carried, the history he had given up for the freedom he, too, had taken for granted. The veteran opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light of the alley. There was no anger in his gaze, no bitterness, just something that could only be described as quiet resignation. It wasn't the first time someone had made an attempt to apologize for an insult or a slight, but this time it felt different. This time, the young man had reached out, not to excuse his behavior, but to understand it. The young man could feel it now, the unspoken weight of shared history. The veteran's life had been shaped by experiences that were far removed from his own. The battles he had fought weren't just fought in foreign lands. They were fought in the silent struggles that came afterward, when the world had moved on and forgotten those who had bled for it. "I wasn't always this way," the veteran said quietly, his voice raspy but steady. "I wasn't always just this." He gestured vaguely to his worn clothes, his disheveled appearance, but there was no bitterness in his tone, only truth. "I was once part of something bigger, but the world forgets people like me, people who gave everything." The young man listened, the weight of those words pressing on him. He had never thought about the lives behind the faces he passed on the street, never considered the stories they carried. He looked at the veteran, the man who had given more than he could ever know, and nodded. The history they shared, though never lived in the same shoes, was now clear. It wasn't just about respect, it was about understanding. And in that understanding, there was something that could never be taken away. The young man stood at the corner of the alley, the weight of everything that had transpired settling heavily on his shoulders. The veteran had disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but the quiet echo of his presence. The woman who had intervened earlier was gone as well, her departure just as swift as her arrival. But Reacher remained, standing just a few steps behind, watching him closely. The crowd that had once lingered, murmuring among themselves, had dispersed, leaving the street empty, save for the few figures who passed by, oblivious to the scene that had unfolded. The young man's mind still spun with everything he had learned. The truth about respect, the understanding he had gained from the veteran, and the quiet strength Reacher had displayed without lifting a finger. He had tried to apologize, but it felt insufficient, like a single drop of water in an ocean of regret. The weight of his earlier actions still clung to him. The insult he had thrown at the veteran, the arrogance with which he had dismissed everything that had come before him. He had thought the world owed him something, but in that moment, standing at the corner, he realized that the only thing the world owed him was the chance to make it right. It was then that he saw him, the man who had been standing in the shadows, watching the entire scene unfold. The man who had stood by the veteran's side and never wavered. The man who had observed the young man's arrogance and had offered no judgment, no anger, only a quiet challenge. The young man turned to face Reacher, the tension between them palpable. "You think I've learned something, don't you?" the young man said, his voice carrying the weight of uncertainty and guilt. Reacher's eyes were calm, his expression unreadable. "Learning is one thing," he said, his voice steady, But understanding what comes after, that's something else. The words struck the young man harder than any insult. It wasn't about simply apologizing. It was about proving that he had understood, that he could take responsibility for his actions. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he was ready for that. But he would have to be. There was no running from the truth anymore. The young man stood frozen, the gravity of Reacher's words sinking in. He had asked for forgiveness, and now, standing before this man who exuded quiet authority, he was waiting for a verdict he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Reacher didn't move. His eyes, sharp and calculating, never left the young man's face, assessing, waiting, as if measuring not just his words, but his very soul. The silence between them stretched, each second feeling like an eternity. The weight of what had happened was impossible to ignore now. The young man could feel the familiar surge of defensiveness creeping up his chest. He wanted to fight back, to claim that he hadn't meant for things to go this far, that he had never intended for anyone to get hurt. But the words wouldn't come. What could he say? What excuse could he make? He had been arrogant, dismissive, and cruel, and now the cost of that cruelty was staring him in the face. Finally, Reacher spoke, his voice low but clear. "You don't get to undo what you've done," he said, the words cutting through the tension like a blade. "What's done is done. The damage is there, whether you like it or not." The young man's heart sank as he processed the weight of those words. It wasn't a condemnation, but it wasn't forgiveness either. Reacher wasn't here to make things easy for him. He wasn't here to offer reassurance or a pat on the back. He was here to make sure the young man understood that life wasn't about escaping the consequences of your actions. It was about accepting them. But Reacher continued, his voice still steady. "What you do from here, that's what matters. You got a chance to show you understand what it means to make things right. Not with words, but with actions." The young man nodded, the weight of Reacher's words hitting him like a fist. He wasn't looking for redemption. Not from Reacher, not from anyone. What he was looking for now was the strength to be better, to do better, and to prove that he could. Reacher didn't need to say anything else. The lesson had been delivered. It was now up to the young man to decide how he would live with it. The young man stood motionless, the silence of the alley now a heavy cloak around him. Reacher had spoken, and for the first time, the young man understood what it meant to be held accountable for something far greater than a single insult. It wasn't just the veteran he had hurt. It was everything he had stood for, the pride, the arrogance, the sense of entitlement he had carried with him like armor. But something was stirring within him now, something more profound than guilt. He had crossed the line, yes, but in that moment, he was beginning to see the truth. The veteran hadn't just been a target for his anger. He had been a symbol, a reflection of the cruelty that the young man had internalized for far too long. The cruelty of dismissing someone who had given everything, someone who had been forgotten by society, shoved to the edges as if his sacrifices meant nothing. The young man's mind flashed back to that moment in the alley when he had spat at the veteran, when his words had been sharp and dismissive. In the moment, it had felt insignificant, like a minor victory, an act of dominance. But now, standing in the aftermath of Reacher's quiet intervention, he could see it for what it truly was, an act of cruelty. A cruelty that ran deep, a cruelty he had been blind to until now. His eyes shifted to the veteran, still sitting silently against the wall, his face unreadable. The young man wanted to apologize again, to try and make it right, but he knew the words would never be enough. The cruelty wasn't just in the act. It was in the ignorance, the refusal to see the humanity in others. He had dehumanized the veteran, turned him into a symbol of everything he had been taught to ignore. Reacher's words echoed in his mind. It's not about what you've done. It's about what comes after. He knew then that it wasn't enough to apologize. It wasn't enough to simply say the right words. What mattered now was how he would unmask the cruelty in himself, how he would face the actions he had taken and the pain he had caused, and how he would work to undo it, step by step. The young man stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him as he looked at the veteran. His apology, though sincere, felt inadequate in the face of the cruelty he had unleashed. He had expected the words to be enough, to somehow make things right, to patch up the hurt with a simple utterance of regret. But now, with the veteran's silent gaze fixed on him, he knew better. His apology wasn't enough. Not because the words lacked meaning, but because they could never erase the sting of the insult he had delivered. They couldn't undo the years of pain and sacrifice the veteran had endured, nor could they restore the dignity he had so carelessly stolen. "I'm sorry," he said again, the words heavier now, each one carrying more weight than before. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. His apology was not a magic fix. It was just a start, and it wasn't going to heal the wound he had inflicted. The veteran's eyes remained steady, his face expressionless, as though he had long since learned that words weren't enough. The young man could feel the depth of that silence, the unspoken understanding that sometimes, no matter how sorry you are, you can't undo the damage you've caused. The apology wasn't enough. It never would be. Reacher, standing just a few feet away, watched the exchange without comment, his expression unreadable. He had known this moment would come. He had known that the young man would realize that words alone could never fix what had been broken. The real work, the real reckoning, came after the apology. It came in the form of actions, in how the young man chose to move forward from here. The young man felt the sting of his failure. His words were hollow. His regret was raw, but it was not enough to undo the damage. He wasn't looking for forgiveness. Not yet. But he understood, perhaps for the first time, that true redemption was not something easily earned. It was something that had to be proven every day. And for him, that journey had just begun. The alley had quieted, the world outside moving on while the young man remained rooted in place. He had apologized, tried to make amends, but the silence that followed was still heavy, still thick with the weight of his actions. There was no grand resolution, no dramatic speech to mark the moment. Just a quiet understanding that he couldn't undo the past. He couldn't erase the insult he had thrown at the veteran, nor could he fix the years of being blind to the sacrifices others had made. But the moment wasn't defined by what had been said or unsaid. It was defined by what came next. The veteran had remained silent, as he always had, and Reacher's presence had been a constant, but it was the absence of words that spoke the loudest. The young man had learned that the true measure of a person wasn't found in grand gestures or flashy apologies, but in how they carried themselves in the quiet moments when no one was looking. He glanced at the veteran one last time. The old man's eyes, though tired, still held a quiet strength, a kind of dignity that the young man could only hope to understand one day. He had spent years on the streets, unnoticed and forgotten, yet he carried within him a history that could never be erased, a history forged in the fires of sacrifice. Reacher's voice broke through the silence again, low and steady. "The world doesn't owe you anything," he said, as though reading the young man's thoughts. "But you can still make it right. The only thing that matters now is what you do with the chance you've got." The young man nodded, understanding at last that this wasn't about seeking forgiveness or even redemption. It was about choosing to live with honor, about earning respect through actions rather than words. It wasn't a flashy victory. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was quiet, a small, steady promise to live differently from that moment on. And that, he realized, was the legacy that mattered, a quiet legacy of honor.